Hello, my name is Nick Bergman. I am a developer out of the St. Louis Esri regional office, and we're going to spend some time today talking about Node.js and Express. It's going to be a basic introduction to the two technologies, and I'm going to show some samples, what they're used for, and then really kind of elaborate on how you can use them in your GIS workflows. I am in the professional services department here at Esri, so a lot of what we do is projects for customers like you guys. So we end up using Node.js and Express for several different things. So we're going to introduce these two concepts and move through some examples. There's not many slides that I've got in this presentation. In fact, this is the only one slide, and that's the repo that we're going to go through. So everything that I cover throughout this will be kind of walkthroughs with code, and then all of this you can do yourself at your leisure by grabbing this repo. So this is what it looks like, the repository, and these are the different sections that we're going to walk through. There are a couple other things that you're going to want to get and look at before grabbing this repo. You will need to install Node.js. So the website for Node.js is this. Download, I think the latest LTS version is the one that you'll want. And then Express, which we'll get into in a minute. You don't need to download that from here. There's a way to install it with the Node package manager. We'll show how to install that too. And then finally, there is another tool called Postman, which I will walk through as well, but I highly encourage you to get that. It's something I use almost every single day to send web requests to a service like Express. So these are the technologies that we'll be going through today. So go ahead, grab this repo, and we will get started. All right, so let's start off by grabbing the repo and looking at the different examples that we've got. So hopefully you know how to use Git. If not, there's plenty of examples and tutorials on how to use Git, but I'm going to copy the URL to the repo, go into my terminal, and clone this repository. And then for everything that I do, I typically use Visual Studio Code. So that will be the IDE that we're walking through with all this stuff. So just kind of give you a layout. Like I said, all of these are going to go through these 6 sections on different topics that we're going to cover. Within each one is a README, so it will go over the basic information that I'm going to talk about here. And then each one of these also has some source code that goes along with it. So that's kind of the layout of all of this. And then we end up with some examples, which I think is mostly just, it's just a README. I don't have any code in there, but we'll give you some of the concepts of other things that you can do with Node, some real world examples. So let's start off with just introducing what Node and Express are. So Node is a JavaScript runtime. It allows you to execute JavaScript code server side. So instead of your browser being the one that's running the code that is in a web application, for example, or a website, it will run code more like Python, how Python works, where you can run it either in a terminal or on a backend server. So it's really kind of handy because if you are a web developer and you're writing web applications on the front end and in JavaScript already, well, now you can also write back-end server-side components using JavaScript as well. So that's a really handy thing. And JavaScript is super flexible with what you can do with it and the language itself. So that's what Node is. It is a JavaScript runtime. Express is a package for Node. It's one of the most popular Node packages, and it adds the ability to send HTTP requests from a client to your server. So your server will be the thing that's actually receiving those HTTP requests, either gets or posts, which is what we're going to go through today, and responding to them. So it really adds that ability to put a web API on your server-side component. So this is the simple introduction to Node itself. There's not much code in here, but it shows an index.js file, defines an array that's got 3 things in it. We're just going to print out the number of items in the array. Visual Studio Code does have an integrated terminal in here. So it's what we're going to use to walk through these examples that we go through. We do have to switch directory into this first simple intro directory to execute this code. It'll be easiest and it's more in line with the way that you'll actually execute these things for real. To run this file, you use the node command and you pass it the file that you want to execute. So if we run that, we'll see that it executed the contents of this file and wrote out the number of items being 3 in the array. Typically, I mean, it's really up to you. This file called index.js could be named anything, but by convention, it's typically named index.js, or I see it often named main.js, but it really doesn't matter. To execute it, you would just use the same node command and then the name of the file that's got the JavaScript code that you want to execute. So that's just an intro to actually running a Node application, and the next we'll dive into a little bit more structure behind it, so it's not just a single file, there's more files, and we get into classes and inheritance. All right, so in the second section, let's go back up a directory and go back into this one. If you look at the README in here, we talk about this a little bit in here, but the syntax that you use and the language that you use is modern JavaScript. So you do have access to all of the ES6 JavaScript conventions within Node.js. So one of the ones that I like the most is the use of classes. So in this example, we still do have our index.js, but we also have additional JS files that are brought into the index.js. So this is the typical example that you see often with inheritance, where we have a series of shapes. We have a base shape.js that defines a calculate area method and a get shape ID method, and then 2 other classes, circle and rectangle, that extend the shape and then implement the calculate area method with the algorithm specifically for calculating the area of a rectangle and of a circle. So it's a little bit more involved. This, again, shows that you don't just have to have a single JS file. You can have a whole source directory of files and classes and inheritance and structures that you would typically want to have in place for any application that you write in Node using JavaScript that's of any complexity. So same sort of thing with this one. We change directory to the classes directory, so let's run the same thing, node index.js, and then this will create 2 instances, one of a circle, one of a rectangle, and then calculate the area of those based off of the information for the dimensions that we pass in the constructor. So there you go. Same way you execute it, node index.js, and it prints out the area of the circle and the area of the rectangle. So this will show that you can use classes and all sorts of other conventions. I mean, I'm not going to talk about it here, but TypeScript is another thing that you could use as well. So instead of writing your applications natively in JavaScript, you could write them in TypeScript and gain all of the goodness that comes with using a language like TypeScript. But that's a little bit beyond this intro one, so I'm not going to talk anymore about using TypeScript. All right, so let's take a look at packages with Node.js. Packages are a way to bring in functionality that other people have written and published out there so that you can bring them into your Node application. And really, to me, packages are one of the things that that bring a lot of power to Node.js. The package repository that's default by Node is npm. So npmjs.com is where you can find and search for existing packages. So there's 25,000 of them out here. There's a ton of them. So we're going to go through how to install packages, and searching for them and finding them is as easy as going to npm.js and bringing that in. If we look over here in the third section that we've got called packages, you will see a package.json file. Let me change directory into that one. This is the file. It's got a lot of stuff. There's a lot more in it than I'm going to cover right here, but I'm going to cover the basics. So this will define the dependencies that your application has. With the sample I've got here and the code I have, we are just going to show some usage of a package called moment.js, which allows you to do formatting with dates, and you can do calculations with dates, and then another one called UUID, which allows you to generate unique identifiers. So they're fairly simple, easy to use packages that will just illustrate in general how to use packages in Node. This one, I've already created the package.json for this repo. But let's walk through how you would create it if you were doing this from scratch. So I'm going to delete this package.json. When you're first starting out and you want to create an application and you want to define the package.json for it so you can define the dependencies that your application has, you will run npm init. This is going to ask you a series of questions that you can fill in, or you can just hit enter to take the default that it's providing for you. We'll walk through all this stuff and say yes. And now it creates that package.json file. Now you'll see it's got no dependencies in it at all because this is just a boilerplate, brand new package.json. Another little trick that I do oftentimes, because I generally don't change, I don't need the WYSIWYG thing that it's prompting me, asking me the questions, I run npm init-y. And then instead of prompting you, it just generates the npm with all those default values. So that's nice. If we want to now use one of those packages in our application, to install packages in Node, you do npm install, and then the name of the package that you want. So we're going to install moment.js. So this is going to hit npm and pull the latest version of moment.js down. It installs into the node modules folder. Typically, you can do whatever you want, but for the most part, we don't source code control the node modules. They are always pulled down from npm. That's why you can't really tell, but this is grayed out because I've got a git ignore file in here that is explicitly ignoring both the package.lock file and node modules for each of these repos, so they're not committed. You'll notice, though, that when I installed Moment, nothing in here changed, because if you want to install it and keep it as a dependency of your application, you have to run npm install the package and then use the save flag. So by doing this, it will update your package.json to have that package that you are dependent upon. So let's go ahead and install UUID as well. And that will pull that one in also. And then real quickly, let's run this application. So we've pulled down Moment. This is how you import and pull in the Moment library into your application. And then this is just showing some calls. A lot of these packages are very well documented. If you go to npmjs.com, let's look for Moment. So you'll see here it is, and it's got, this one actually has a GitHub, or it's got a whole homepage for it. So you'll see the documentation for it and how to use it. A lot of them are, like I said, are really well documented. So use those docs for the specific packages that you're dealing with, and a lot of this will make more sense. So this creates a new moment at a specific time. It creates a duration of 2 days, and then it subtracts that time from the original time and writes it to the console. And this one just generates 3 UUIDs and prints them out to the console. So again, typically like we do, node index.js, and we run the application. For the most part, so when you've got your package.json file defined, it's got the dependencies in it that you want. Like I said, you don't commit that to the repository. So when somebody gets an application for the first time, which you'll have to do when you get this repo, because the node modules aren't installed. Let me delete this so I can show you what it does. So now we don't have any node modules installed. In order to install everything that's defined in the package.json, you will run npm install. This will interrogate the package.json, look at all the dependencies that your application has, and then pull them all down together. So running that, you'll see it added the 2 packages. So that is the moment and the UUID. So that's why we don't commit the node modules folder to a repository. It's really, we're depending upon whoever gets the repo to install the dependent modules themselves running npm install. So that's basic about packages. Next, we're going to take a look at Express and how to use it. And like I said again, it is just a node package like Moment and like UUID. So let's flip over to the fourth folder here that has Express in it. Let's close this. Change to that folder. And then let's talk about what Express is and what it does. So again, here's the package.json for this one. It's already got Express in the dev dependencies. So like I mentioned, since we don't source control the node modules, let's run npm install on this folder to pull down all the dependencies, which in this case is just Express. So Express is it's a web framework that allows your node application to communicate using HTTP. So typically you're familiar with HTTP GET. That's when you're just loading a URL in a browser, it will run a GET. There's also a series of other ones, puts, posts, things of that nature. We're going to primarily focus on the GETs and posts. So this is what Express looks like. You require the Express module, create a new application. You specify the port that you want it to run on, which is really completely up to you. You can run it on whatever port you want. 3000 is just what they want, or what they typically use as a default port for Express applications. And then there are two methods on here. They call these routes. So the app.get and app.post, those are the types of requests that we're going to handle. And this is the route that we're going to handle the request on. So I'll show you an example of both of those in a second, but then we have this command to tell our server, our Express server, to start listening on that port. So let's run this. When we kick it off, we log out this log message to say that we are successfully up and running and our application is listening on port 3000. So if we go over to our browser now and do localhost 3000, we executed what Express has on that default route, which again is this one right here. So the / is the default route for your app. And when we run it, we get hello world. So pretty simple response to a get. The second one is a post. So the way that I typically run the posts, you have a couple options. They're difficult to send straight in the browser by hitting a URL. You could do it through your console in the browser. You can also do it using a command line utility called curl, which if you're familiar with that, it can send posts and gets. But this is where Postman really comes into play. That's how I test all of the post requests that my application is handling. So let's take a look at Postman. Let's create a new request. Give it I won't do it this way. Let's cancel that and add it through here. So by default in Postman, the requests are gets. So I can run the same request that I did previously from here. So there's the get to the default endpoint. You can also switch it to a post. And in this case, our post is on the handle post route. So we will type in handle post here. And we can run that. So if we run that, in this case, we're actually returning a JSON response back. That's what that res.send, and then internally in that is the JSON response. So this shows that we can create an Express application that both responds to gets and posts that it has received. In the next section, we'll talk a little bit more about passing some additional parameters into our Express application and how those are handled and how we can generate those with Postman. All right, let's take a look now at passing additional information into these endpoints. So let's flip over to the passing data section. Let's go up a directory again and then change down. Let's kill a running application. And then there we go. Now we're into and run the npm install on this as well. And in this one, you'll see there's two ways that we're going to pass parameters, and then yet another package we're going to deal with. So now in our package.json file, you'll see we're still using Express, but we've also added an additional package. It's actually called Express Middleware that is a body parser. So this will allow us to pass in JSON in a post to our endpoints, and it parses it for us so that we can obtain the parameters that were passed to us. There is quite a few things that I've got outlined in the README here that talk about different useful Express middleware. There's one called Cookie Parser, which deals with parsing the information from a cookie that is sent by your browser to the server. There's another one called Cores that I've dealt with before, so that's cross-origin resource sharing. So you can do things with Cores that if you want to whitelist specific clients to access your server, you can do that with Cores. There's a bunch of documentation on Cores as well. I'm not really going to go into that, but just know that there are a bunch of other components out there that allow you to put middleware in place for Express. And the way that's done, so similar to what we've got set up before, the additional thing that we do is we actually tell our Express application to use the body parser. Now there's two endpoints we have on here, both a get and a post again. This get will use URL parameters so that the client can pass information. And then the post is going to take, like I said, the JSON input parameters, and it's just going to echo them right back. So I'm going to use Postman again for both of these requests. With this one, we'll change this from that post that we had before to the get. And now we will use with URL parameters as the route that we'll set things to. We're going to, this in Postman is where you pass in the URL parameters. This one is looking specifically for a first name parameter and a last name. So let's do first name, Fred, last name, Flintstone. And we need to go ahead and start our application, or we won't get a response. Oh, it looks like the body parser is deprecated now, so there is a different way to handle that. So that's a good thing to look at as well. But let's go with what we've got. So I'll send this in, and then the application responds with you sent, and then the two values that were passed in. Oh, and I actually typoed that. That's little L. So let's try it one more time. There you go. You sent Fred Flintstone. So that's how you can send in URL parameters to this. And we can do this too, the same exact thing, since it is a get and not a post. That can be done from the browser. So you don't have to use Postman to do that. You can send it there too. And that's how the URL parameters look when you're sending the request through the browser. So parameters are separated by an ampersand, and they begin with the question mark. And then it's parameter equals value, parameter equals value. So then moving on to the post, and for the most part, in the Express application, Express servers that I write, I don't typically handle URL parameters. I just go ahead and start using a post. So let's switch this. Actually, let's create a new one. Let's change it to a post. We're going to be doing localhost 3000. And then the endpoint that we're going to hit this time is handle post request body, which these, I mean, they can be anything that you want. They don't have to be these names. And then in order to get Postman to send in JSON as the body of a post, you come over to the body tab, you tell it I want to send raw data, and then in the raw data, I'm going to send JSON. So this, we can enter in any JSON that we want. So let's do the same thing here. First name, and then this is JSON syntax for this. Let's just stop it. First name is Fred. Let's send that in. And the way that this one is set up is it's just going to echo back the same input that it got. So if we look here, we're getting that information from the request body. And it's the body parser that is adding that body parameter to the request. If we debug this, we go back to Postman and send the same one. Oh, I don't have it running that way. Let me run this in debug. So this is another thing to show too. Like you can run all of these. I've got, if you run it in Visual Studio, I do have a launch.json set up so that you can run these applications this way too. So let's go ahead and run. We're in the 5th one now. Let's run that, and it will run it using Studio. And now we can hit a breakpoint. So send that same request. We hit the breakpoint here, and now we can inspect this request. And if we look at the request.body, you'll see first name, Fred. So this allows you to send all sorts of parameters in. You can send arrays, you can send nested objects, you can send all sorts of information to your Express application as input data. And then the output data that it's showing here, echoing back the same input data, it also can be a complex JSON object that contains arrays, nested objects as well. So you can instruct your server to do all sorts of stuff by passing in this parameter. All right, so that wraps up just some basic input parameters. The final thing I want to talk through is, just some real-world examples of what you can do with this. So one thing, using Node on its own without using Express, let me show this in a little bit better way, is build systems. So we use this heavily for creating the build systems for our applications. So typically the way that works is we use either a Node package called Gulp or Grunt, and then you can build steps where you're running unit tests, I spelled unit wrong, or you're minimizing your code or deploying your code to a server. So any automated build steps that you can do that you're doing manually by hand, you can automate with Gulp or Grunt as a task runner using Node. Another thing that we use is proxies. So, Node is receiving requests on gets or posts. So if your application is making a request to like a third-party service somewhere, and you want to manipulate the data that third-party service gives you back in a more usable format, you can actually make that request through your Node server using Express, and then have Express go ahead and reach out to that third-party service to make the request. And then when your Node application using Express gets that information back, it can manipulate it however it wants and then send it back to the client. So proxies are a good way to do that. And I do mention down here, no, I don't, yeah, I do mention it. So Coop, if you've heard of Coop.js, it's a Node package that we put out that does essentially this same thing. The Coop providers are implementations of that manipulation of the data between the third party format of the data, and the way that it formats it is it turns it into a response that looks like a response from an ArcGIS server REST endpoint. So Coop essentially is a proxy that mimics an ArcGIS server, and it does that by proxying the request and massaging the data to turn it back into something that our JavaScript API is expecting, mimicking the ArcGIS server. Another thing that's useful too is data scrapers. So one of the examples that I use all the time is the Missouri Highway Patrol here, where St. Louis is at, has a traffic crash website. And it looks like this. It is updated every day, but the data that it's got is not in a really useful format. It's not on a map. You can view the details of it, and it will give you a lat long, but I want to put that information on a map, not look at it in this tabular format. So you can have a data scraper that you've written that uses, in this case, there's another package called Node Schedule, which runs a cron job. So you can instruct it to run every 5 minutes, every day, every 2 days, whatever you want on that interval. You can hit that website, parse all the information you want out of it, and then turn it into data that can get written to a feature service. So that's another really useful thing that you can write with Node, and not really even in this case using Express. It's just straight up using Node. So these are some of the examples of what you can use it for. There's plenty of other utilities that you can write that use Node and Express. So hopefully this gave you a pretty good intro to what it was. We barely scratched the surface of what you can do executing JavaScript on the server side using the rich options of the Node modules that are available to you. So hopefully you can go do something cool with Node and Express. Thanks for listening.